Um, I'm Sarah Mayrovitz, one of the student planners on the Oregon Brain Tank. On behalf of University Housing, I welcome you to this Community Conversations panel titled Deaf Jam, Poetry in the Deaf Community. The Community Conversations series is a living and learning initiative of the University Housing, produced by the Oregon Brain Tank, which is an undergraduate academic group in the residence halls. The Oregon Brain Tank meets on Tuesdays at 5:30 in the Living and Learning Center Ducks Bistro conference room, which is right across the way. We would love to have you join our group or simply stop by and suggest panels for the panel topics. Before I introduce this event, I want to also let you know of another event that's happening on February 6th, which is yesterday. It's February 16th, I'm sorry, I was reading the wrong place. There's a World Poetry Night coming up, put on by the Mills International Center, and apparently it will be captioned, so there's more information about that on the table over there, which you can look at after the panel. I want to quickly acknowledge our co-sponsors tonight, the Robert D. Clark Honors College, the Oregon Humanities Center, Undergraduate Studies, and the UO Library, who have collaborated with us for 8 years to make this series possible. The event tonight will conclude at 8:30, and there will be a question and answer session at the end, so we ask that you please hold your questions until that point. At this time, I'd like to introduce Joe Larson, who will serve as our moderator for this evening's panel. Take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, for all of your hard work, and thank you all of the sponsors to this terrific program. I think that the best idea is to just get right to the film, because you're going to learn a lot from the film. And then following that, we'll have a short, about half-hour panel discussion and open it up for questions that you might have relating to the film or relating to other things. The film is entitled Deaf Jam, produced by Independent Lens, was shown on PBS not long ago, but it seems a lot of people in the Eugene area couldn't see it, so thrilled to be able to present this to you tonight. Think about poetry, think about words, think about what they mean. Think about what they might mean in a visual or signed language. Think about what they might mean in a spoken language. And can the two actually come together? So let's go ahead and watch our film.
Hello, my name is Valentino Velasquez. This is my sign name. I'm the second-year ASL instructor here. I work with Joe Larson. We are involved in the Communication Disorders program here at the university. I'm happy to be part of this program this evening.
Hello, my name is Linda. I am a part-time staff employee as a lab instructor, also working with Joe. And I was born deaf.
Hello, my name is Heidi Course. I'm a teacher for the deaf here in Eugene. I also teach a class here, ASL for Educators.
And I, as perhaps you know by now, am Joe Larson. And this is our entire ASL faculty here at the University of Oregon. In that kind of context, I'm hopeful that some of you will have some questions regarding deafness in general. But more specifically, if you have questions regarding what you just saw and or comments about what you just saw, this is the perfect forum to do that. I'm going to try and change lights a little bit so we can see the audience because I know you might have some questions. Yeah. We also, just kind of a little hint as to what's to come, we're going to have one brief live performance of an ASL poem as well. All right. So if I may, I'm not sure what you know or what you want to know. So why don't I open that up and see if we can get things started. And you can holler. We have interpreters. I may make you run around. I don't know. We'll see. They know everything. I think that's going to work better. Thanks. I don't know that works better for the camera. Sorry. They know everything. Perfect.
What happened to Anita? Did she end up going to Gallaudet? Do we know?
Happen to know. Gallaudet turned her down because of her immigration status, and so she was not able to go. She's still participating in all kinds of theatrical endeavors now. I hear rumor that there is a special benefactor who will be paying her way. Really though. Comments? Okay. I'm going to turn it over to because I feel that perhaps our panelists have comments, questions for the audience, but mostly comments about what you saw, your experiences in the deaf world, your experiences with poetry, with the differences between English, ASL, and how that all fits together in your world. You said you can go.
Where should we start? Oh, there's a question.
There is a question.
There is a question.
Okay, trouble.
Well, for Pam, do you have any experience with students like her in your group when you was growing up?
So for the persons who have experienced schooling in either the mainstream or residential program, did you have any students similar to Annette that you're aware of?
This is Heidi. Yes, I have.
Heidi.
Similar to Anita, I remember one student a few years ago, and her personality was very bold, very strong, very confident. But I wasn't sure where she fit in the world. Was it deaf? Was it hearing? It was really difficult to figure out. And so that's what we've been talking about. And I met her in high school. Now she's a sophomore in college. And honestly, when I see her, she's amazing what she has done, what she has accomplished, and who she has become today. She reminds me a lot of the character in the film in that way. Anything to add?
Did you have any experiences with students while you yourself were in high school? Anybody that you saw that was
Oh,
similar?
me? No, none. I didn't have anyone who I could look up to, who I could learn from. Now, understand, I was mainstreamed. I didn't have very many friends. It was not, they were not in my grades people of that stature. And so she had a lot of friends. She socialized a lot. Understand, her school was small. She only had a few friends to choose from. So I did not have that. My experience was different. Linda says no. Valentino says really she's searching for her identity between her language and her culture and who she is. Now, I grew up in Colorado. I did go to a residential school. Actually, I went to a mainstream school. They did have a deaf hard of hearing program. And there was a deaf education teacher there who was hearing, who could sign, who I could communicate with. But I really felt lucky there was one deaf teacher there. And what's interesting is he did not sign ASL. This teacher signed C, signing exact English. Actually, seeing essential English. And this deaf man would sign, and it was very much English grammar, English style. And he had grown up in England, and he had graduated from Gallaudet. And when they first decided to use sign language, they used that signing essential English. Later in my experience, a woman teacher showed up, and she signed C2, which is signing exact English. It's interesting, though, the ASL poetry, the man whose name was David Nothi, Anthony, he was the creator of this, and he was a teacher back then, very strong, written poet. He would write poems, and he would write them in English grammar, and he would use sounds almost rhyming with the words. You know, he grew up using speech, using rhythm, using words. And at the same time, he would sign the words exactly as it would be spoken in English. And so I feel like that's mostly my experience. Similar to Spanish language, I have deaf friends who use ASL. I have friends that use Spanish. And with C, it's signing exact English. So I can share my experience through ASL and through C using ASL and using English at the same time and being able to translate those emotions from ASL to an English language. And I really do have to thank a deaf teacher for that, even though that teacher did use C signs. I remember later, I transferred to a school for the deaf. They had an ASL celebration at the school. And so there were many people in Colorado who were going to this celebration, and it was the first time that I had really experienced ASL through this celebration. Through theater, I got involved in ASL poetry, and I had never really seen that before. I had not understood, because my experience was strictly English signing with poetry. And I was amazed how different it was and how different my experience growing up was than to see this ASL poetry. And I began to go to workshops. And one day, I remember so clearly, I had gone back to my school and I was telling my parents, I'd gone back home about the differences between signing English poetry and signing ASL. And really, there's uses and places for both poetries. But I really discovered that ASL poetry was something that I was so impressed. And my parents really thought that that was an important thing for me to learn.
I think that was similar to my experience too. I learned sign later, and so English is what I'd known until I had seen ASL. And of course, at Gallaudet, in my time, we had what was called the Rothskeller. It was a very small bar, and people would go and listen to music, and you would always know that there's English involved with the music, and there's words and lyrics, but it was never performed in ASL. I would always try and follow the beat and feel how the music felt and the tempo, and if it was upbeat, be happy, and if it was slow, be sad. So that's one point that I have in relation to music. But in regards to ASL, wow, I had to practice how to express ASL in that manner to represent the English.
Excellent. I don't know if some of you might have noticed the two different signs that Valentino used, poetry and poetry. Would you like to mention the history or background of those two signs?
So poem, P-O-E-M, the P that looks like the music symbol, is really related to the English word related to music. And that is an English sign for poetry. It's the P and music. And that has been set up because of rhyme. And that follows English structure. So P with music, this is the sign for music. In ASL, really, it's not related to the English word phrasing at all. It represents a visualization through your body, an action, a feeling. And that action and feeling is connected together. And so the word poetry is this sign, which comes from a feeling, which comes from your heart. It does have nothing to do with music or listening to music or rhyme or rhythm. It has to do with emotion. That's where the two signs, the poem or poetry.
Thank you.
I was watching on the computer earlier, and there was a really big discussion about should we interpret ASL poetry or not. I was just wondering what you guys thought.
Excellent question for the panelists. Thank you. What do you think? Should you?
Heidi says it depends on what is the goal. Are you studying and analyzing what the English words mean and transferring them to ASL, or are you looking at the big picture? What's the visualization?
If it's for the goal of visualization, that would really be difficult. Figuring out what the point of the story is and then getting the main ideas and representing that conceptually is hard for me.
I think it's interesting in the movie, maybe I'm wrong, but she said it's better to write first, then sign, than the other way around. Is that correct?
Yes. No, well,
That happened to be the hearing person from Palestine that was her theory. She preferred to write first and speak second. But the deaf student did not preferred the opposite, not to write it, had never written an English translation of her poetry.
That's why she didn't want to use an interpreter. Right, okay. So I guess it depends on the person. It depends on what the goal is. Yes, I agree. Valentino says it depends on the genre, depends on the language. It depends, let's see, for example, deaf experience with this sign, writing the poem in English, using standard English, writing the poem, and then you look, and it's important to have both languages to have that strong foundation. So you read the English, and you see the pattern of the English and how the poem is described. For example, the stanza. So the words of the poems, how they're put together and how the words come up. Do you repeat them again and again? You would write that in English. And then when you read, you understand, and then you can translate that into ASL. Really, it's important to have a strong foundation with both languages. Also, another way could be if you practice and use the ASL first, and you talk about your experience and you have a language structure in ASL, and then the person plans to write it in English, to make that an English poem, that means how would you construct that poem so that it's clear in English, so the ideas are clear in English? And so the ASL poetry is set up first and then written into English. I've also heard of ASL poets who sign and then they feel they cannot provide the richness that they can sign it. They cannot provide that in English. And to have an interpreter, it actually depends on the genre. Because if you're planning to say a poem that's more English-based, maybe that would match better using an interpreter. Also, ASL poetry often uses sign shapes, hand shapes. So for example, numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hand shapes. And that's included in poetry. How do you relate this to nature? Can you relate this to people? These hand shapes. Hand shapes are a very important part of ASL poetry. You cannot translate hand shapes into English poetry. It's impossible. So, can you? I ask you. Some say yes, some say no.
I would add that the English language is very linear, while ASL is really so much three-dimensional and you have so many things going on at once. Can you really put that into words? We were kind of giggling a little bit while we were watching the slam poetry, and I know that many of you have experienced listening to and watching slam poetry. And can it be interpreted into ASL? So is there some sort of fair match where sometimes spoken English can't be interpreted with all its emotion behind it, and sometimes ASL can't be interpreted with all its emotion behind it? I think there's some equality there.
And Heidi says some information may be lost.
And that's just the basis of that thing we call interpretation.
Now, at my school, I was writing. First, I would sign it, and then I would change it to English, and it was really hard for me to figure out how to get all my thoughts on the paper in English. It's really frustrating, and I have to practice and practice and practice and practice. And I have to do it again and again and again, and I get very tired. And then I feel like something else, like every day I'm writing English and I'm writing English, and sometimes I don't understand myself if I write the English first. And I'm writing and I get confused and I'm a little shocked. And so then I need help, and I'm writing so that I can understand, and that helps me.
Perfect. Do you have a preference? Prefer to just sign a poem?
Me? Yes. So if you sign it first, then Heidi says later you can change it to English. Is that what you're talking about? Maybe, she says. So it's the same as now. You know, you're working on an ABC story. What are you doing first? Do you sign it first? And then do you write it down, right? Yes. First I sign it. First I have it in my head, and then I sign it. I sign it all the way through, A to Z. And then I will add the ABC part 2, and we'll change it. Heidi says change it. First you sign it, then you write it into English second with help from the teacher. You translate it. And so you're learning, oh, ASL looks like this and English looks like this. Maybe it's a little bit the same, but maybe it's different. Yes, she says. And Valentino would like to add, oh, I'm happy that you brought that up. You're talking about writing English with poems, and I remember a deaf man named Willard Madison. Oh, wow. He has a poem called You Have to Understand Deafness. You have to be deaf to understand. And he wrote in English about being a deaf person, the difference between hearing and deaf. And he wrote the poem in English, and it was beautiful. And I remember at Gallaudet, there was a teacher who would use this poem. He has since retired. But really, it was a struggle on how to make that poem into ASL, because it wasn't something that you could listen to, because the English itself was written to be listened to. Really, the poem itself was full of imagination. It was artistic. It didn't mean that all deaf people could change that poem into an ASL poem, and many hearing people could appreciate while they listened to the poem. And really, it was really interesting. I applauded this teacher for using this poem because you could have hearing people and deaf people appreciate, and that's why it has stood the test of time.
So in the movie, they discussed a lot about how difficult it is to translate a poem into sign, or a signed poem into English. But I was wondering what your experience is specifically with interpreters generally, and whether you find communication gets lost in the interpretation, just in general communication.
Heidi says sometimes for me, if I'm signing, sometimes the interpreter might use a different word. It's not the word that I would have used, and I feel, no, that wasn't the right word. That's not the word I wanted to use. For me, maybe it's more a choice of words or word choice the interpreter uses. It's not about miscommunication or the communication not happening. It's word choice.
For me, I can speak well. I prefer to speak and to have someone interpret for me, meaning interpret what I say.
Great question. I believe Heidi and I were in the hot seat here. It's important to have a good language skill. It's important to understand culture, to value culture, to understand the history, the generational perspectives, and how people have grown up. For example, let's see, Japanese class. Maybe you take Japanese language and you're learning how to speak Japanese language, and so you write the language and you can communicate through written language. And they use a symbol for their language. I don't know, it maybe looks something like this, and it has a line and 2 lines and a dot. What does that mean? Maybe that is 3 or 4 different ideas in one symbol. And then you add another squiggly line, and that's 2 more ideas. You add a line this way, it's another idea. That is a lot of information to be able to describe in one symbol. That's an example. Signing, maybe 1 or 2 signs can mean 7, 8, 9 different ideas. That's where the interpreter must have had training. 2, now I believe 4 years in an interpreter program, meaning that interpreter must have the language skill in ASL and in English, both the experience, the socialization, the going to school. Understand, yes, the theory is important, but the language skill, that means I would say about 7 years. I think 7, 8, 9 hours a week. You need more than that. You need many years to be fully immersed. It's not just enough to go through school. You have to be immersed to have the experiences, to understand the language and the history and the point of view that has happened generationally. It's not just interpreting into English. It's not just being a translator, going from English, translating into Chinese, going from Spanish, translating into English. Wow, I hope that answered your question.
Do you think that it's important to, for people who are looking at ASL poetry or citing poetry to have an ASL background, or do you think that they miss out when they don't have an ASL background? Or how much do they miss out?
Are you? Give me more, Nina, of how
Okay, so
general
saying
you're
that,
asking.
For me, I don't have a very deep understanding of it or knowledge of ASL, but I still can see some of the signs that they're trying to incorporate. But do you think it's important to have a sense of ASL, or do you think people who do not sign can still get the meaning of what the poet is trying to say? Does that make sense?
It does, but
Am I word vomiting too much?
no, you're perfect. If I may respond quickly. To use Valentino's example, if you took a 2-year language sequence in Japanese, do you feel that you could do some poetry in Japanese? So the equivalent is, do you feel like 2 years of learning some basic structure, some basic facial expression, some basic vocabulary will give you enough to do that thing that's inside, that expression of emotion? Will that give you enough to do that? So you just answered your own question.
I mean, I know. I still wanted to ask it.
Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, don't know.
I agree with you, really. You have to be involved. You have to be able to use expression freely. Some are fortunate to have that skill. Some are slower. It depends on the individual.
A question for each of you.
So Shakespeare, which of you do you think you translate Shakespeare into English? Our preference? Joe's asking our preference.
I never liked Shakespeare.
Heidi says, I've never taught Shakespeare. I really highly support bilingual. So that would mean ASL to the English. But I've not yet taught Shakespeare, so I better hurry and figure it out, I guess, before I have to teach it, before I get a high school class.
Really, you must read the story, understand the story, and then you can think about interpreting the story. You can't just take a stance and go, here's the signs, and get the point of it. It's really difficult.
I'm curious, who of you have studied drama or studied acting? Raise your hand. Show of hands. Yes, a few. 1, 2 in the, okay. So I'm sure you have read Shakespeare. And, you have to really love that English. It's old English. It doesn't match today's English, right? So we have to look at the perspective from back then. Really, it's different today. It's really a special kind of English. Since it's old English, we don't often use those same words, and so we have to figure out what it means as well. It can be a challenge. Shakespeare, wow, there are many workshops on analyzing his language, his use of grammar. And your question is, can it be interpreted into ASL? If that deaf performer is involved in Shakespeare in the play, if he has studied and has analyzed and understands and can match the English and the ASL, I believe sometimes it can work. Sometimes it can't. And Heidi says, I would like to add, I know that here we have the Shakespeare Festival in Ashland, Oregon, and there is a deaf actor in those plays. And his name is Howie Seago, and he's involved in many of the Shakespeare performances. So maybe that's something that we should go watch. Maybe I should do that myself. Valentino says yes.
Do you guys like reading poetry in English, and do you feel like you appreciate it as much as a hearing person does? Linda's saying yes. I do. Linda says yes, I do.
It's a challenge for me, reading English poetry. When I'm reading the poem, I have to get the big picture. I have to see it in my head. And I do like poems, yes.
I would think that there would be a problem, like when we watch the deaf poetry slam, and they're putting an emphasis at the beginning of the word or the end of the word, and they're using tones and stuff. And then if you were to take that same poem and write it down and reread it, it doesn't have the same effect. And I think that that translation of tones and feeling would be lost. The same way, on the other end, having facial expressions and the feeling of ASL coming through. When you put them both on the paper, it doesn't really work. So I would think that there's a wall there.
Agreed. Unless you're fortunate, like Joe is, to have both. And I was kind of bragging about that today, that my first language, ASL, was quickly followed by English. And so I'm fortunate that I get to watch, listen, read, sign, all of those. But to answer your question about do I like to read English poetry, I might be different. I have to sign it or it makes no sense to me. Background. And so all of us, yeah, can be a little bit different. I know that our time is running out, and I would like to make sure that you have the opportunity to see one live poem that none of us have seen yet, except the performer. And so I think what I would like to do is briefly thank everybody for being here, and then turn it over to Valentino, who has just an explanation of your poem, and then we would like to sit in the audience and watch you.
I thought Heidi was going to do a poem too.
Yeah,
Oh no. I didn't have a poem planned, Heidi says. Good evening. I want to talk a little bit about the background of the poem. The poem is entitled Hear and See. Hear and see. Hear and see represents one person, but really represents three people. Hear represents a hearing person, their experience from birth to death. See represents a person who is deaf and his life experience. The third person, hear and see, that person has a deaf identity, but also has a cochlear implant. That is see and hear, because they have had the cochlear implant. So actually there's the hearing person, the deaf person, and the deaf person with the cochlear implant. I'd like to explain the background. And this has to do with my experience, the people I've met, the perspectives, my experience. And I have analyzed my experience and put it into a poem using three different people and their commonalities. with their experiences and their stories. And so I'd like to share these ideas with you. First, family with parents. Second, dog. Third, friends. And fourth, trees. You will see birds and so on. And so you will also see love, including in weddings, and parents who have their first child. This is all related to the hearing, the deaf, and the deaf person with the cochlear implant and their experiences in these life stages. So I would like you to look when I sign. When I sign this means hear. When you see me sign this, that means see. So you know I'm going to sign this often, so you'll see hear and see. And you'll see that I sign them in 3 different spaces. I'll also sign using 3 different levels. The first level, we'll talk about the hear people. The second level, we'll talk about the deaf people. And the third level, we'll talk about the cochlear implant. Now, I've chosen to do them on 3 separate levels because that represents the population, the majority population. Is the deaf the majority? No, the hearing is the majority. So there, I'm signing them near the top. So the deaf population would be second, and then the third would be the population with the cochlear implant. So I'm going to start. The interpreter is only going to voice a few images. Everything else is going to be silent. I would like for you to watch. Are there any questions before I start? Hear parents speaking. Love. See parents signing. Love. Hear, see parents talking, signing. Love. Dog. Friends. Trees. Bird. Mother. Talking. Love. Woman. Signing. Love. Wedding. Music. Inspiration. People watching baby, daddy, doctor,
Beautiful. Thank you. With that, we leave you to think about the things that we've discussed tonight, the things that you've seen. I have a feeling some of you will process the information in due time. If you need to contact us, there's always a way here at the University of Oregon. Please do so. We'll be here for a few minutes to answer questions individually, but thank you all for coming, and thank you, panelists, for being here. I appreciate your time so much. Thank you so much, Kevin, for all your support here with University Housing and the Brain Tank. And thank you, former student Sarah Meyerowitz, who still stubbornly says, come, give us another panel. Thank you all. Good night.